When we are working with a computer, it has some resources in it that we usually need to protect. Those resources could be of different types. For example, the most important one is the information stored in that computer. If we have some files there, some personal information, some password, whatever, we don't want that anybody that is not authorized to do that access that information. But we have other resources that we must protect. For example, the CPU. We must restrict the use of the CPU of the computer to those people that we want to do that. For example, we don't want that somebody from the internet runs a crypto miner in our CPU. Maybe the memory is something that needs to be protected because perhaps some users has access to the memory and we don't want a user occupies all the memory, leaving no memory for the users, maybe the network. We have all the resources of our computer must be protected. And we can do that because we have all the programs running in a computer are running on top of an operating system. So we have the operating system, we have the programs here, the users access the computers through that programs, and we can implement the resource protection here in the operating system because the operating system is the only program allowed to access our hardware, our resources. Because it's the operating system, the one that is performing the resource protection, it will different for each operating system. For example, Linux will have its own way of protecting resources. Windows will have its way of doing that. Mac OS, whatever, it will be different for each operating system. In this unit, we will see the resource protection in Linux system. In any case, for protecting a resource, we need to do two things. The first thing is to be sure that the user who wants to access the resource is who he or she is telling us she is. So for example, imagine we have a resource here that belongs to Alice. The first thing that we must do is to be sure that the user trying to access is really Alice. That process is called the authentication. So, for example, if this person tried to access the resource, we she is not Alice, so the authentication process will fail and she won't be able to access the resource. So in this case, for example, if the real Alice try to access, the authentication process will pass and she will be able to access the resource. The authentication process can be done in different ways. The most used is perhaps the user password authentication, where you enter a user, you enter a password only known by you, and then the system uh, authenticates you, and then you will be the user because you are the only one that knows the password, But there is not the only way. There are multiple systems of authentication. For example, digital certificates. For example, smart cards. For example, biometrics way of authentication system. So there are many ways, but we only see user password authentication. The the second step that we must do is when trying to access the resource. For example, this is Alice. We have Alice authenticated. Then we must perform the authorization process. The authorization process is the process that that we check if the user that is already authenticated, and because we know that Alice is Alice, is allowed to access this resource. In this case, she is authenticated, she's authorized to access this resource and she will be able to do that. But imagine this case, we have Bob here. Bob is a user of our system. It could be authenticated. For example, Bob could enter the system um, with a user and a password, a correct user and a correct password, but maybe he's not authorized to access the resource. So authentication will pass, but authorization not, and she won't be able to do that. So those are the two steps that we need to do to protect resources: authentication and authorization. And we will see how to do that in Linux system in the next videos.